I think to kick things off, when you think about how IT and business go about developing, delivering, executing, deploying, and using, a broad range of analytical apps, there's probably more change occurring now than there probably was, in the last 15 years. And, this period of change, I think, has been kind of really starting a few years ago, and it's really kind of increasing as we speak. And, in similar to most situations, right, change is being driven by disruptive forces. And, those disruptive forces, we think, there's obviously probably more than this, but we think that two of those major disruptive forces that are out there, one is there's really an emergence and adoption of new technologies, right? And the simple answer to that is obviously Hadoop, but it's more than that. And then I think the second category is there's an emergence of new streams or sources of data that can tend to have a lot of value in the right context for organizations. To kind of drill into this a little bit more, when we talk about the technology, and Tripp is going to talk even greater detail about that, but like I said earlier, it's not just Hadoop. For example, it's the emergence of a layer of applications and functionalities that are on Hadoop. Like a good example of that is really the emergence of even ACID-compliant SQL database functionality on top of Hadoop. So an example is one of our clients is in the marketing services space, and they collect, consolidate, and aggregate massive amounts of consumer data for a large number of their consumer clients. And they're actually in the process of doing a POC, for example, right now, where they're moving from a traditional relational database platform to a Hadoop-based platform. And the interesting things that they're seeing, first and foremost, they're getting similar, or in many cases, better performance from a query standpoint. And then from a hardcore data integration, which is important for them because of the volumes of data they're dealing with, they're actually seeing fairly massive improvements. And then the other component of that is when you look at the annual licensing costs they pay for traditional relational database technologies versus this, it's literally lower by a factor of 7 times. And then the incremental storage costs are lower by a factor of 3 or 4 times as well, right? So Tripp will talk about that in more detail. But that's, I think, something that's really driving a lot of change, right? Forrester recently came out with an article, where they say basically Hadoop, for example, is not an option for CIOs to be considering anymore. It's pretty much a thing that you have to be looking at and doing, otherwise, you're probably not in a good career situation. Secondly, when we talk about new data sources, and we're going to go into greater detail, especially on the social side, but really the wealth of data that you can obtain, hopefully in a permission-based manner, about what consumers are doing in the social space, can be immensely valuable for retail, consumer packaged goods companies, any consumer-facing company. And then obviously when you go across a wealth of industries, the streams of machine or sensor data that you can get, which people generally refer to as the Internet of Things, also enables a lot of new opportunities to leverage analytics. So moving forward, we're going to focus the majority of, at least my part of the discussion, on this emergence of social data. When we think about how organizations use social data, we kind of look and think that there's 3 pillars. So the first 2 pillars, companies do that a lot already. And what we're really talking about there is, first and foremost, it's leveraging social channels as a way to deliver brand impressions for little or no cost, right? So the whole idea that, if you like Starbucks on Facebook and Starbucks post on their page, there's a 10 to 20% chance, depending on who you are, that their message is going to show up in your news feed, right? And it literally costs them absolutely nothing to do that. And you can deliver, millions of brand impressions for very little or no cost, right? A lot of organizations are doing that. Kind of the next step is companies that are actually trying to leverage social sources like Twitter or public comments on Facebook or other sources, and using sentiment analysis to gauge sentiment about their products, their companies, how to do market release work. And then some companies kind of take that to the next level. You see this a lot, for example, in hospitality, travel, hotels, where people are actually going to the next level and engaging in social CRM. And what they're actually doing is engaging with these people directly, especially the people that are unhappy, and trying to address their issues, right? And there's a lot of software as a service-based platforms primarily that most organizations use to accomplish this. Now, the third category, which is where we think there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of times for organizations to further exploit the social channel, is when you think about a lot of large consumer organizations. They've invested, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars in database marketing, campaign management, marketing automation, one-to-one platforms that are really focused on leveraging all the enterprise data they have in their solutions. But what they're not necessarily doing is looking at all the data that's available out in social channels, once again, hopefully in a permission-based manner, and figuring out how to integrate that data back into their traditional platforms so they could be more effective in their traditional approaches to one-to-one interactions or database marketing, campaign management, whatever you want to call it, right? And we'll talk through that in a little bit more detail. We'll actually give a case study as well. The one thing I want to point out when we talk about that third category, there's a concept that's kind of critical to that. We call it social login. And I'm sure you've all seen websites where you can log in with your Facebook ID or a Google or a Twitter or maybe even a Tumblr ID. And that's really what we're talking about is organizations leveraging social login as a starting point. And based upon that, getting access to a part of a consumer's profile in a permission-based way, integrating that with other information they have about those consumers, and then leveraging that more effectively to give them more relevant, more targeted, more timely communications, right? So what does that really mean in detail? So when we talk about this concept of integrating social data and enterprise data, there's a couple key components we would typically think that a solution like that would deliver, right? So one, it's that ability to integrate with Facebook or Google or Twitter or Tumblr, right? It's having APIs that can literally go out to those sources for the people who have already used social login on your sites and actually accessing their profiles, bringing it in, keeping it in sync. At a later time, if they decide to revoke your permission, is actually taking that into account and updating your data about that consumer so it stays in line with the Facebook or Google policy. Another component of it is having, after you've brought it into your environment, having a flexible data model that can store the enterprise data, store the social data, and then also figure out that Duane Lyons from Facebook is also the Duane Lyons that has a checking account, right? And obviously that specific kind of functionality there really overlaps pretty heavily with what people might refer to as master data management. And then there's a third capability, which is really more of a rules engine or other type of approach that's really focused on looking at the social activity and actually figuring out what their interests are, right? So for example, looking at a person's Facebook likes and seeing that they like the Starbucks page, so maybe they like coffee, right? Or a music example might be seeing that somebody likes Metallica and I don't know, some other heavy metal bands. So you determine that one of their affinity attributes is from a genre standpoint that they like a specific style of music. Or even more complicated on top of that, if you do any kind of analytics or social segmentation, it's figuring out the oddball things, which is, believe it or not, that people who like Eminem have a high likelihood of liking Adele, believe it or not. And that's that's true, I think, actually, believe it or not. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about bringing social data and enterprise data together. Now, so why is this important? So we've removed the attributes, but from this is real Facebook data from a real client. We've actually removed, like I said, the attributes, but what we looked at was for a series of consumers that we were able to match between the enterprise and between the social space. What we're looking at here is for the enterprise customers, for this graph here, for these key attributes, the percentage of the profiles that were populated with those attributes, right? What we're looking at over here is for those same attributes, the percentage of the Facebook profiles that were populated with values for those attributes, right? So if you look at this from a marketer's perspective, and we're not talking about basic things like name and address, right? We're talking about affinity attributes that tend to give you insight into a consumer's brand preferences, right? So what should jump out from this is that obviously Facebook is a really robust source of data for consumer profiles. Obviously that varies based upon geography and demographics, but in general it can be immensely valuable. And what we show down here, it's kind of hard to tell, but in this specific example, the average Facebook profile actually likes 8 bands, right? Which may or may not be relevant or important to you depending on what you're marketing in the consumer space. Okay? So kind of taking that to the next level, a case study of this actually, so we worked with one of the world's largest, if not largest, manufacturer of adult beverages. And this organization, across a lot of their brands, in general, adult beverage is probably one of the more progressive, but they've been one of the early adopters and users of social login across all their branded websites. So we worked with this client to do exactly what we talked about on the prior slide. We integrate their enterprise customer profiles together with the social profiles they have access to because they've leveraged social login. And built a more robust consumer profile. We've built out a series of 278 or 9 demographic attributes based on primarily Facebook activity. And they actually use this as a way to drive targeted, primarily email communications to their consumer base about a nationwide concert series that they promote and sponsor, right? Their old approach used to be to send the email out to the millions of people in their database, regardless of what their likelihood was or wasn't of responding, right? So, in my example earlier of the person who likes the heavy metal genre, they would just go ahead and send them, an email about maybe a Taylor Swift concert or something like that, right? By being able to do this, by being able to employ what we call social segmentation on top of the platform, they were able to identify, they were able to rank everybody in their database as to how likely they were to respond. And then the likely responders, which admittedly are probably less than 3 to 5% of the overall population, because we're talking about a database of millions here. The likely responders, for those people who ended up receiving the emails, their response rate was 25 to 30%, right? And we're talking about things like opening emails, click-throughs, and even subsequent activities such as potentially even purchasing tickets via Ticketmaster. Traditionally, their email open rates are 2 to 3% at the most. The other thing we found out on the reverse end of the spectrum, right, is that by identifying the people who are least likely to respond and not mailing them at all, you're actually able to reduce the amount of unsubscribes you get. So, because a lot of email marketers take the approach of, well, I've got 5 million emails in my database. Even if it's a relevant offer or not, I'll just email it to everybody because it doesn't cost anything or relatively much at all to execute campaigns via email. But unfortunately, the downside of that is if you're sending the wrong offer to the wrong person, you end up with a significantly higher unsubscribe rate. And the problem with that is as soon as you have that person unsubscribe, you lose your right to ever contact them in the future with a relevant offer, right? So that's the real value that this client has seen in it. And Forrester, if you hear terms and kind of how you relate them, Forrester kind of refers to this type of solution as what they call the database of affinity. We actually call it Consumer 720, and I'm sure you'll hear more and more terms for things like this. So before I go any further, any questions at all? Okay. One thing I did want to do is, I know it's early, but I did want to ask, just maybe with a show of hands, one a couple quick questions. So when we're talking a little bit about, obviously, big data, so is Dan. With just a quick show of hands, how many people in the room are currently involved in some type of initiative that they would refer to as big data in general? Okay. And are those, of those, are there any that aren't Hadoop related in some way, shape, or form? Okay. 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 Cool. Okay, you don't know yet. Okay, okay. So it's not technology specific yet. Okay, okay. And then of the people that raised their hands, excuse me, when you think about what you're doing in the big data space, is it more exploratory, doing a proof of concept, or is it more we've done that already, we've shown the value, and now we're actually implementing something that would be more of a production or enterprise platform? Exploratory? Okay. Okay. And I mean, that seems to be consistent, right? Over the last few years, we see a lot of organizations that are doing exploratory, and we actually are seeing now more and more organizations that are kind of moving beyond that, but it's still a lot of organizations doing things in exploratory fashion. And then the last question is, when the people that are looking at big data solutions, how many of those are being driven by kind of new data sources or new data streams that you're not used to? Any? Okay. Okay, cool. Okay. So, well, thanks for that. So the other thing that I was going to touch on for a few minutes is, it's not necessarily in the realm of consumer social data, but back at the beginning, I indicated that one of the two disruptive forces that we see causing a lot of change in the analytics space is not only new technologies, but it's also really new different data streams that, if used appropriately, right, in the right situation, can add a lot of value. And in general, the other big, in addition to social data, in addition to traditional web log, digital data off of websites, the third data stream, which I think Forrester and Gartner both predict to be the largest data creator, data source in the world, if not now, in the very near future, is all the data that's being created off of sensors and machines, right? What generally people like to refer to as the Internet of Things, right? A lot of times we actually refer to it as the Ethernet of Things because a lot of times it's actually behind a firewall. But the concept is pretty simple, right? You've got machines with sensors. They're connected to each other. Those sensor readings can get stored or logged in some kind of historical repository, and then you can perform analytics on that data by itself, or in most cases by integrating it with other data sources to add more value, right? And then, like I said earlier, the Internet of Things is a big concept, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so, for example, for me personally, I focus a lot on it in the manufacturing and energy space. Tripp, as our CTO, gets involved in it across industries. But typically what, and I'll walk through a case study of this as well, what we really focus on is what we call the industrial Internet of Things. And really what we're talking about there is level 1, level 2 control systems, programmable logic controllers from platforms from vendors like Rockwell Automation, GE, Siemens. We're literally taking that sensor data typically off of a manufacturing process or off of maybe an oil rig or some other type of equipment in the exploration space, integrating that data with data from other sources and actually using it for analytics, right? And obviously, the volumes there can be pretty significant. For example, in the energy space, we have a client that has hundreds of rigs out in the field that are in operation. So it's actually over 300. And each rig has 4,000 sensors on it. And each sensor gets sampled and has the reading stored in what's called a data logger at every 50 milliseconds. So you got 300 times 4,000 times every 50 milliseconds. That's the amount of data that, in theory, that they're creating. And it's not all of it's useful. Granted, there's probably, of those 4,000 sensors, there's only a couple hundred that are really useful, but it's still a fairly significant volume, right? And then the other case study that I really want to talk about is we generally see in the Internet of Things, we really see two use cases primarily. One is where you take machine sensor data and you integrate it with maintenance data from an MRO platform, and you're using it to make better decisions about when either manufacturing processes or in-field equipment is going to break down. That's the example I just used from the oil industry. The other example is where you take machine or sensor data and you integrate it with data from a quality or lab testing system. And in that case, you're using it to actually figure out why a particular quality defect may have happened in the past, or or predicting when quality defects might be occurring in the very near future. And in this case, this was for a major integrated steel mill. By leveraging a visualization tool on top of the sensor data right where it was stored without even integrating it and moving it, integrating that with quality test results, the quality engineers were very quickly able to visually correlate a particular odd sensor reading with a finished product that was failing quality control checks. And they were able to actually, as a result of that, make a change to the manufacturing process. It was actually a change to just how the operators ran the lines that ended up allowing them to eliminate about $10 to $15 million in annual costs from a standpoint of having to remanufacture the same products that were defective before. Okay?